Cool. Okay, we're about to begin with the keynote of today. We have Freja and Aslak here with us, who is going to talk about their experience with teaching digital self-defense to journalists in Denmark. Let's give a round of applause for them.
Thank you. I'm gonna start like straight on with can we get the screen up and perfect with a picture of Aslak in a very exotic place in northern Jutland, which is possibly the furthest away you can get from here in Denmark, and a rather small city, very, very far away from NSA and Snowden disclosures and all that. This is a group of local journalists in northern Jutland, and Aslak is teaching them digital self-defense. And then we have some other pictures. This is a picture from the Danish School of Media and Journalism. For some weird reason, that's also located in Jutland. And this is a crypto party where we are teaching journalism students digital self-defense, which is now mandatory at the 3 Danish universities of journalism. We have some more pictures from that too, so you can just skip like 3 forward. And this is a picture of Snowden. Opening the Scandinavia's biggest journalism festival last year in Odense, and that was subsequented also by a series of workshops in digital self-defense. And then the last picture is the extract of the digital security policy that the Danish Union of Journalists subsequently adopted, which obligates them to work against illegal mass surveillance and for the right to digital self-defense. These are some of the things we've been working with here in Denmark for the past two years. 2 years ago, almost no Danish journalists knew anything about surveillance, let alone the need for protecting themselves or how to do it. And yet, somehow we've gone in the past 2 years from that and to a situation where all Danish journalists are offered education in digital self-defense in their local branches or in the school when they start. And what has happened in those 2 years? How did we do this? These are some of the things we're going to talk about today. We're not going to talk very much in detail about digital self-defense, because I'm pretty sure that most of you here, or all of you here, know more about this than I do. But we may have some experiences with how to communicate this rather complex stuff to people who have absolutely no knowledge of it beforehand. And this is what we'll be talking about today. I'll start by introducing ourselves. My name is Freja, and I'm a journalist. And Aslak Ransby is a digital security trainer. And we've been working together for the past 2 years, among others, with writing this book, Crypto Guide for Journalists, which also has a website, cryptoguide.dk, and with doing the digital security trainings at the School of Media and Journalism and in the local branches of the Journalist Union and other places. 2 years ago, I was one of those journalists who knew nothing about how to protect myself digitally. I knew that I had to. I had a feeling that it was really irresponsible to work with sensitive sources and not knowing how to protect them. And I sort of had this, it was right after the Snowden disclosures, and I sort of had this, I know that this is a problem, I know that I should know how to protect myself, but then I also had an idea that digital self-defense, that was something with like dodgy hacker types doing like weirdo stuff in the cellars dressed in like anonymous masks, or having weirdo hacker camps at like faraway islands like Bornholm, something like that. And I was like, oh, but there are so many tools, and when I start working with it, they're all like, oh, then you need this, and you need this, and something called Tails, and what have you. And I just sort of, it was just sort of too much, and I closed off, and I was like, it's probably okay, nothing will happen. And I also sort of had the idea that many of my colleagues had the same approach to it. But then I got a source where I had to know how to protect him. It was an officer from the Danish intelligence who leaked some confidential documents about Danish war crimes in Iraq. And then there was pretty much not a question anymore of not having the energy to learn about the tools or anything. I just sort of had to learn how to. And then I sat down with Aslak and a lot of other experts on this area, and many of them are also actually here today, Peter and Kamse, for example, and just sort of sat down and bought like a shit ton of cake and asked them to like teach me everything. And it was actually really good that I had absolutely no knowledge in the beginning, because it meant that I could ask all the questions that all my colleagues without knowledge would probably also ask. So the only one who had the patience to sort of keep explaining it to me until I understood was Aslak. So we sat down for a little longer, and he explained me all the things, and I installed all the tools on my computer. And that learning process where I learned how to do it is actually what we wrote down in the book, because we thought other journalists might benefit from that too. So that was how it all started. And after we wrote the book, we realized that a lot of other journalists felt the same way. They knew they had to learn these tools, but there hadn't been an explanation or an introduction to it that was easy enough for them to understand, easy and sort of simple enough and speaking in their language. So this is what we started with, and this is what we'll be talking about today. So we started, I think, if you skip to the next slide. The way we started is that we did this, actually a very interesting cooperation between the students, organizations for the journalist students, and the IT Workers Union here in Denmark, PROSA. They're student branches. We did this collab where we organized a whole day seminar at the School of Media and Journalism, where we had both talks, and we had a whistleblower out to talk about how it feels to be exposed when you're not properly protected, and different talks. Peter was talking about the Snowden disclosures and different talks, and then we also had a bunch of IT activists from PROSA's student union who met with the journalism students and taught them the tools they needed to know, because when they would be done with their education, and when they would come out there as Finnish journalists, and this is a collaboration they needed. So this really fruitful and interesting collab between techies and journalists is what we based the education and the courses that we started making on. So we had this series of whistleblower classes, or digital self-defense classes at the School of Media and Journalism, and they became quite successful. It was right after the Snowden disclosures, and everything had sort of this Snowden or to them. So they became quite successful. People were actually standing in line just to get in and learn how to protect themselves against surveillance. And that rose an interest, which meant that we could push it through to become curriculum in the schools, and also further on to be offered to all the already educated journalists in the local branches of the journalist union. So what we'll be covering today is lessons we learned from speaking human, so to say. The first lesson we learned is that we have to make it relevant. When we began these classes, we talked a lot about Snowden. We talked a lot about Glenn Greenwald, and that is really interesting. You can hear about that for hours, but the problem is that there aren't very many Danish journalists who will ever have a Snowden case. Danish journalists, they work with a lot of sensitive sources that need protection, such as like poor people, or people who are being hit by the social system, or whistleblowers in the public sector on a far lower stage is not the right word, but on a far closer to the like everyday working situation stage than intelligence officers and NSA and so Snowden and Glenn Greenwald is not really the reality that most of Danish journalists face. So we had to find a way to make it relevant also for local journalists in northern Jutland, because the whole I'm never going to do a Snowden story, this is not relevant for me, is a question we heard quite a lot. So that was lesson number one. Lesson number two is that we had to make it digestible, so to speak. The orange color on the book is not because I have some weird fetish with orange, but we knew that we had to make it sort of look easy and speak a language that journalists and communication people understood, by giving it a brand and making it recognizable and making it look like, okay, this is something that I can use, this is something that I want to sit down and listen to for 2 hours. So that was a very conscious choice also. And the third lesson learned is that we also had to make it manageable. There was when we began this, the techie community had they sort of wanted to teach everything. You know, come to a crypto party and we'll teach you everything. But you can also use this tool, and you can use this tool, and you can go even further and use this tool. And the problem was that the journalist reacted to this by getting all confused, and it was just too overwhelming and too much. So we had to make it very structured, and we had to make it very sort of targeted towards this is what you'll need in your everyday life. There's this, and there's this, and there's this. And then if you get an actual Snowden story, you probably need some more tools, and we can continue. But we had to make it manageable in the first place, because otherwise they simply wouldn't follow us. Yeah, I think that was
So a bit more about that. As Freja said, Snowden was like a huge attractor for doing crypto educations of journalists, and especially now. Maybe not so much more today, but there are new digital realities that journalists have to react to. There's election hacking is also getting some traction as well. But the Snowden effect was pretty much what made this possible in some sense. And the way we approached it was at first looking to like what we knew about doing like teaching and outreach in the tech community, and we did and we basically looked at the crypto party format, which was a type of event we had done a couple of times, and crypto party is pretty much the geek community that figured out that telling people to use crypto is not enough. Like, we have learned the practice of doing crypto, of thinking about IT security, of reasoning about how networks and communication works. It's something we have learned doing like years of hacking, practicing, figuring things out, and expecting people to have like the same kind of understanding that we have, that is really nonsensical. So Crypto Party was a really nice format in the sense that it gave people a place where they could come and practice with the programs and try to gain some practical experiences on using different programs and trying them out, and do that in a safe environment where we could like help people out in a really local and one-to-one situation. And that was kind of what we tried to replicate at the journalist schools, but we pretty quickly found out that it's kind of a format that's really hard to scale, so there are too many people for one thing. And then like people's expectation of like the crypto stuff was kind of weird, because the non-techies that had listened to the Snowden story, they were like really excited about it, and they had some one more time, sorry. And they had some really wild expectations of like how this crypto training could empower them and what they could do about it, and they had really no sense of what it all meant, except that if they went to our crypto party, they would like not make the same mistakes as Glenn Greenwald. They would get the next Snowden story. And the expectations were kind of weird compared to the reality of practicing cryptography, encrypted communication. So people got this expectation that we would give them a new superpower, and in reality we forced them to install Thunderbird and Enigmail, and they experienced all the problems of practical cryptography. Like, there was some new stuff that they didn't know was a part of this deal, like keys, surveillance, a lot of knowledge, hidden knowledge that we take for granted, but that was really a big wall to climb for a lot of these people who don't really have any specific technical interest. It's like, for them, technology should be an enabler for to do the work they find interesting. And like working, like figuring out the concepts behind key-based cryptography is not that important for them. So we had to change that up a bit. And we had to figure out how to deal with all the crypto folklore that was around. Like, we kind of got into the head of people, and after doing this for a while, we figured out like what works, what doesn't work. But we also figured we learned some new stuff about like average people. Like in Denmark, 50% of the population is IT illiterate in practice. And when we like approached journalists and we wanted to help them getting started with encryption, we were like, yeah, you need to install these tools on your phone. And when they handed us the telephone, it was like filled with malware and adware, and the passwords were horrible. And we kind of figured out that we had to go away from the idea that we needed to help people install and get experience with using applications, and we had to move our focus into working with the literacy, the understanding on how digital communication works, how packages are switched through a network, how interception works, how encryption works. So one of the questions we got a lot was basically like, yeah, but encryption doesn't really work, does it? You know, like people have these weird ideas. Some people were afraid to update their computers. Like the last time I updated, something went wrong, so I don't feel safe updating my computer. So you have all these kind of weird ideas about digital security that comes from people not having any concise mental models or experience on how computers work in general. So just to wrap that part up, I think one of the main lessons that we learned in this process was like the problem was a lot bigger than we expected, but it's not really a hard problem. It's just not a computer problem. It's a human problem. So figuring out how people learn, how they get experience with stuff is a big part of it. And figuring out how technology works in practice and what parts are hard was really a big influencer for us in modifying our courses and making them more approachable for people.
And if you have any questions in between, just please let us know, or if we talk too fast or too loud or too low or anything. So the latest thing we did was a tour to all the local branches of the Danish Union of Journalists in like very, very small, obscure Danish cities. We actually do have cities that are less obscure, believe it or not. Like we have a capital, for example, but we also have like a bunch of really, really obscure small cities very far away in the countryside, which is very, very far away from Snowden and that whole thing. So that was very interesting to go out there and making this relevant for people very far away. And we've brought some of the slides and the structure of the presentation and the workshops that we did in the local branches, because we thought it might be interesting for you to see. Most of the tools we'll mention here will probably not be new to you. You'll probably know all of this already, but it might be interesting to see for you how we teach these tools and how we structure making people understand why they need them. So remember we talked about relevance and context. The first we did is putting this into a political context. We make people understand that we are in a political situation now where it's easier for those in power to keep an eye on us, and more difficult for us as citizens and as journalists, for my part, to keep an eye on those in power. These will go pretty fast, the slides. So just, one more. Yeah, and sorry. That is a serious democratic problem. And one more. They will go pretty fast, these slides, so you can just like skip through them. And we made them understand that this is not only challenging our constitutional rights, but also our working conditions as journalists, because we have an obligation to protect our sources and our material, also when the communication and material is done digitally, as most material and communication is now. Skip. The second lesson learned, as you remember, was, the third lesson was make it manageable. And I want to go a bit more into how we did this. So the first thing we did is teaching people that security is not just about tools. Of course, it's also about tools, but tools change all the time. Tools get compromised, and it's really easy. It's really important to understand that you don't have a quick fix tool that that sort of solves all your problems. One of the things we experienced was that people showed up and they wanted to learn, for example, PGP, or they wanted to learn something else, and they asked, what tool do I need as a journalist that will solve all my problems? And there's nothing that we would have wished more than to just be able to say to them, this tool, this is a tool you need, and then just teach them that. But that doesn't really work, because you need different tools in different situations. Now, Danish journalists, for example, very few of them need PGP, because very few of them communicate with sources who know how to use PGP. Some of them communicate with, for example, people who work in the public sector and who want to disclose confidential documents, or documents that can get them into trouble if it's found out that they've been communicating with the source. So, I mean, for them, perhaps using Signal would be much more relevant. Some of them travel in areas where it's where it can be a very high risk if the local sources there are found out to be communicating with Western journalists. For example, photographers who travel in conflict zones and who travel across borders with the pictures of the people that they've been talking to. They need to know how to use full disk encryption to protect their hard disk, or how to communicate to send out what they've the pictures they've taken, to send that back safely to the offices in Denmark without people getting in trouble because the local intelligence services intercept the communication. And then some other journalists, they communicate with workers where the problem is. For example, we had a case in another city in Denmark. We had a case where local dock workers were organizing an illegal strike, and their employers simply took the phone, because it was a phone that belonged to the workplace, and looked at the text messages on the phone. And in those cases, if we were as journalists communicating with them, it wouldn't really have helped us to know PGP. So they need to simply understand how to tell the source not to use a work phone when communicating with them. So we teach them that security is not about tools, it's about understanding the surveillance threats and making a threat model over them, analyzing the threats that you face, and then picking the right kind of tools and measure you need. So in order to make it easy for them to pick the right kind of tools, oh wait, I'll get to that. Sorry. We also taught them how to differentiate between daily routines and high alert. Because what we did at the local branches, for example, was a 2-hour course. And what we do at the Danish School of Media and Journalism is a 1-day class. And you can't learn how to protect your sources if it's a high-risk situation where your adversary, for example, is an intelligence service. But what you can learn is to understand how to have a good everyday security practice, and then get to know whom to contact if you get that high alert situation. So we teach them, what we told them was that the tools you'll learn today and the measures you'll learn today is stuff you need in your everyday practice. And then if the next Snowden contacts you, you need to ask for help by asking people such as Aslak or most of you sitting in here. So yes, so that was one thing we also taught them. The next. And then we taught them that the security awareness they got from those classes should be an everyday practice. Just like we lock our doors or we lock our bicycle. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. It's from the slides we brought there. Just like we lock our doors or we lock our bicycle. And just like the way we make security measures, knowing that if it's a really shitty, rusty bicycle that is possibly painted pink and nobody wants to steal, then we don't really have to lock it that well. But if it's a brand new racer bike, we have to lock it better. Or if we leave it for the weekend at the central station, we also have to have a better lock, or possibly more locks, than if we just leave it in the backyard where we live. Those kind of security measures and security thinking, they needed to take from their sort of everyday physical life and put that into their digital life. And then we brought them a toolbox where we had organized the tools in different categories and gave them some kind of tool so they'd have an understanding of what tool do I need in what situation. So the tools or the categories we gave them was, first we taught them how to protect the equipment, and we told them that tell them that this is kind of like having a lock on your house. We teach them full disk encryption. We don't install it with them when we're there, because well, you know the drill. If you forget your passphrase and your full disk encryption, you're pretty fucked, and we didn't really want to have that responsibility, but we taught them what full disk encryption is, and in what situation they need to, that they always have to do this, but for example, when you cross borders, you need to close down your equipment completely, and so on. We also taught them that it's not enough. You also need to update your systems and your programs on your computer, and if you are in a situation where you need a higher security, for example, you'd need an air-gapped computer. But yes, full disk encryption to protect your equipment, be it your phones or your hard drives or your computer. And then once you've put a lock around on the house, it's really important to make sure that it's actually also a good lock, and you do that by having strong passphrases. So we've used either the Diceware method or the Snayers method to teach them how to construct good passphrases, and then we help them construct some passphrases as an example of how it can be done. And then we teach them how to also have a good culture around the passphrases. I'm going very quickly through these tools because I suspect that you know most of them, but just ask if you have any questions. We teach them how to protect those passphrases with a password manager and have them type in their email at Have I Been Pwned to understand why it's important not to reuse your passphrase at various accounts. Then we teach them how to protect themselves online. We do that with two-factor authentication, with HTTPS everywhere, and with Tor. And yeah, we teach them how to protect their communication by explaining to them the principle of end-to-end encryption, and we use a picture of the open postcard versus the closed letter because it's a very easily understandable picture. What we give them is Signal. And we use quite some time teaching them Signal. It's the only tool where we, at the short classes, it's the only tool that we insist that they all go from there with. And what has happened is actually that my Signal contact list has grown from like 5 people to, I think I have like 500 now. There's a very, very big community of Danish journalists who have Signal now. And that's really important because that's where it really starts to matter, if they can communicate with each other and they can make groups with their colleagues when they work on a project and so on. So we help them all to install Signal also because it's so easy and because it's a tool that it's very, very useful for them in their everyday practice. It's very easy to tell a source, even without any kind of technical knowledge, just to install Signal on her phone and take a picture of a document with the app and send that. If you have a source who is, for example, at a workplace who wants to disclose a confidential document. If you start asking demands for the source to install PGP or doing something else, it quickly gets too complicated and you lose this important story, or the source try and find ways around it that are less secure. So it's really, really easy for the journalists to get Signal and for them to teach their sources how to use Signal. We also give them Signal for desktop, and then we also talk about Messenger and WhatsApp, and we'd rather not. We know all the problems with all the data they keep and all that, but the problem is that journalists use this. There was a university project about how journalists work with digital security in their communication done a year ago, and it showed that they don't. 2 years ago they didn't, and it showed that an alarming number of journalists use Facebook Messenger to communicate with their sources. And the problem is that if we just tell them don't do that because Facebook and third parties and blah 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 blah, they'll just say, okay, I can't use this for anything. So what we do instead is we explain to them what is the difference between having the secure thing put on the Facebook Messenger app, the thing where it's encrypted. We tell them that how it's encrypted and what are the limitations. How much metadata does Facebook keep as opposed to how much does Signal keep, and the same with WhatsApp. And then we introduce them to PGP by explaining to them how it works. But as we've explained, we don't go that much into details with PGP because it's actually not very useful for them. A funny thing about PGP is that, as Aslak mentioned, there was this sort of an idea that, oh, we have to get PGP because that's what Glenn Greenwald used, and we want to be the next Glenn Greenwald and all that. And actually at some point there was there were quite many people, journalists in the union, who wanted our help with getting they wanted the union to offer their members an encrypted PGP email service. So they were communicating with this German company and asking if the union could host an email service with encrypted email, and we actually sort of talked them out of it, because I mean it would be a really nice stunt to have the journalist union offers all their members encrypted email, but the problem is that this is not what they need. They need to understand how to analyze the situation. And there's also a lot of dangers attached to leaving a lot of communication that you say is secure in the hands of a private company. So that's a very good picture of how sometimes what they think they need is not really what they need. Then we, of course, also explain to them about data and metadata. Yep.
So email encryption is really funny when you teach people encryption, about encryption, especially if they don't know much about IT. So I actually found out during some of these sessions that you can use, if journalists want you to teach them email encryption, it's like a good heuristic to expect that they really don't have an appropriate mental model about how internet communication works or how encryption works, because their expectation is basically that we can solve the metadata problem, that we can send encrypted emails to people who doesn't have PGP installed themselves. And all the misconceptions that they have by reading about the Snowden case or reading about encryption tools and not having people to talk about this stuff is it's really common. So usually people ask us to help them with encrypted email because they don't know what else to ask about. They don't really know about the possibilities. So at first we kind of started by basically going through the email PGP Enigmail setup process with them. And a lot of people, they got really shifty-eyed and looked at what we were doing to their computer in mad disbelief and couldn't really make any sense of what this was all about. So we kind of moved and using the email encryption as a kind of an icebreaker to talk about more general concepts about what is encryption, what's encrypted when you send emails encrypted, what's not, the metadata, how can that be used, and how might this distinction between encrypted content and metadata be important in your case? What kind of persons are you communicating with? And a lot of them are communicating with public servants where you have the communication logs. So even if they send encrypted emails to those persons, you would still have the metadata trail, and that would be a problem for them. So, yeah. Yes. The journalists, they pretty much started to want to learn encryption to not miss out on the next Snowden story. But when you look at some of the social science that have been done, where you actually look on, there are ethnographic projects where people have conducted surveys and qualitative interviews with journalists to figure out how is their work practice when it comes to their digital security. And one of the findings is basically that trying to enforce a PGP regime on your internal news desk communication actually is a big burden for the journalist, and they lose stories because of they use some tools that are really hard to use if you are a really weak computer user, for example. So I think during this process, we kind of digged into some of the social science that was done about how does this encryption stuff, how does the digital security work in practice, how does it work out in the wild, and how should we reflect on that in our training and the way we approach it. And of course, like focusing on the realistic threats is a really important thing. Like getting into the mindsets of the journalist, figuring out what kind of sources do you have, what kind of protections do they need, and then use that as the basis of teaching them stuff, teaching them OPSEC about the way they should approach them. And in general, focusing on the realistic threats, but also helping them doing the threat model. There is this anti-pattern in the geek world where we kind of tell people that it depends. Like, should you use encrypted email? Should you use Tor? Should you use Signal? And it's like, it depends on your situation. But people don't really know how to analyze their own situation. So we can, it's a thing that we try to teach them, but we really need to help them all the way. And a lot of the basic stuff, like the communication security is one thing, but like nobody is teaching anyone like basic IT safety, phishing things, that it's important to update your computer. So we actually also found ourselves in a situation where we are doing like basic IT skill training for people, because there are huge gaps in people's IT skills within like a professional field. Like journalists can be like horrible or really good at computers. There is really no like defined level in that profession. And of course, like in all other parts of society, phishing is a huge problem for journalists, especially because they have to click on stuff to make their stories. So when people send them tips, it's really not an option to delete the email or not look at it. So that's one of the problems we have to figure out. A part of having the focus on realistic threats is to try to figure out what is the reality of the Danish journalists. So one of the initiatives that Freja have taken within the journalist union is to do a survey of what kind of compromises and security problems journalists experience, so we actually know what's going out there. We know in general, like in the general population and in companies, that phishing is a problem, password reuse is a problem, like the common things, but we really want to have more knowledge about the everyday threats of Danish journalists and try to keep a tab on that, so we can use that as the basic basis for our training of the journalist, and not some expectations on like following the trends of like high-scale NSA-driven crypto discussions or something, but that, yeah, trying to make it more fitting for the Danish journalist context. Let's do the next one. So, like the human problem in the teaching digital security is kind of important, but it's not really a hard problem. It's just a problem that the people outside the traditional computer science field are better than at solving than people who have like a strictly computer science background. And we should really try to embrace some of the research that have been done in those areas. For example, the stuff that Rina is doing is really the stuff we have to look at, like how do people actually perceive app permissions, or how do they actually use and create passwords, like why does it suck, the thing that people do. Usually there are some really reasonable explanations, and as techies we can learn about that and adapt the way we make our programs and the way we teach people about security to reflect on the knowledge that we are basically given for free if we just take our time and look at it. And we basically also have to try to figure out new ways of putting knowledge into the heads of other people, and it's a difficult problem, but we have tried to do some stuff. We did an internet LARP, like a role-playing of internet communication at a conference for that's a hard word. Investigative journalists in Brussels in May, and what we did basically was we constructed a really basically a token ring version of the internet around a table where people had an IP address and a role, and we had people send, if you go to the next slide, It's cropped in a really weird way. But basically, we had some pink unencrypted packages that people were routing around the table, and we had some green packages with encrypted content inside that we routed around the table. And we used like physical objects to give people a sense of, like, when you do stuff on the internet, whether it's encrypted or not, other people is going to see it, and what exactly they can see depend on the programs you use and like the route the traffic takes. But those concepts are so abstract for people to understand, so like trying to do it with the paper packages was quite successful, and we want to like build on that, but also thinking about using board games, whatever, like teaching things to help people understand concepts that are really, really hard for them to understand. And a lot of the advice we actually give users really depends on a deeper knowledge. Like there is Forbrugerrådet, the Danish Consumers Council, they advise consumers to use a VPN service because of security reasons. But nobody that gets that advice and read it to really understand what a VPN does or whether it's applicable for them. So we kind of have to figure out strategies where we can teach people about the concept without expecting people to become experts. I don't think it's a goal that people should have the same knowledge as us, but they should have like the least necessary amount of knowledge to navigate in some of these things.
And this is some of what we've achieved when we look back over the last 2 years. The situation we're in now is that most journalists are aware of this situation. They know it's a problem. They know that they have a constitutional right to privacy, and they know that the authorities are breaching this right, and they want to act against it. They are not security experts. Most of them either know Signal or will get to know Signal through their education or in their local branches, and then they know whom to reach out to when they need more help. So that has been like a massive change of consciousness in the last 2 years. So the question is, what now? Because we don't want to just stop here. So the next steps we have, as Aslak mentioned, we are looking into what kind of security threats are journalists facing, so that we can make the tools even more targeted and useful for the journalists. We are also working with, and I should probably add that a major advantage for us has been to go through the collective organizations, the IT Workers Union PROSA and the Danish Union of Journalists, because they already had a network, and once we got them to understand the importance, it was really easy to get out to the member base and have the structure for that. So the survey is done together with them about the members and the threats that they face. A next step is also to make some of the media bosses take on their responsibility and have security protocols and allow the members to install these tools on their equipment, because that is also actually quite a big problem, and to make secure ways on the media websites such as Secure Drop and so on for sources to contact them. But also we are going to work together with the IT departments at the media houses to look into the security threats they face, because they often get the mails and the phishing mails and so on before it actually reaches the journalists. So that's one next step. Another next step is that we're working together with journalist unions all over Europe to get these experiences out to other European countries, but also to other countries where journalists are facing far more serious threats than we are here in the current environment. So, for example, I've been working with colleagues from Kurdistan or from Western Sahara to teach them some of the security tools too. And then, of course, this is a sort of a two-legged strategy, because one thing is to teach journalists how to defend themselves digitally. That's important enough in itself, but it also has a political leg to it, the strategy. Because by teaching people digital self-defense, we also remind them that they have the right to protect their privacy. They have the right to confidential communication. And as I said, somebody is trying to breach this right. So that creates a political environment where, for example, it will be very, very, very difficult for the government if, for example, they want to try and ban some of the encryption tools that we use, such as Signal or Tor. They'll probably do it anyways, but the thing is that now they won't face a few journalists who work with these surveillance issues. They'll face maybe 2,000 journalists or something who all have Signal on their phone and who are like, why do you want to ban this tool that I use for my everyday communication on my phone? And that's a really big difference. So one of the next steps is also to continue that work within the Journalist Union and PROSA, but also with digital rights activists and so on, to put pressure on to defend our right to privacy and put pressure on the politicians who want to breach this right. So I think this is pretty much what we had to say, and we have some time left for questions now.
Do we have any questions for them?
Yeah.
Hey, hello, can you hear me? Okay, so thank you a lot. I want to ask a question about this typical crypto party scenario. You have people, they show up and they want to learn how to encrypt their emails, so you install some Thunderbird, and then maybe they haven't tried to use Thunderbird before, and then you at their email account or whatever they have, and in my experience maybe it takes 3 hours. Maybe you can tutor, maybe one person can tutor 4 people, I don't know. It doesn't scale that well. So my question is if you've had any luck approaching newspapers, media organizations, and kind of push your program so that they will invest the resources in teaching their employees these methods. And I know that Thunderbird maybe is not the type of software that you can have a media organization install, but maybe they have other means of using PGP.
Yeah, something we actually realized after we did this for almost a year was a lot of the work we're doing right now is basically something the bosses should be doing and should be paying for. So we are doing like the free education of their employees. But it's like an ongoing debate. We are trying to push it into the media organizations and work with them because it's the place where it should be, I think, in a lot of cases. But that's just not realistic the way things work out now. But hopefully... Oh, yeah.
The Journalist Union just yesterday adapted a strategy where they're gonna have like a meeting with the media bosses and like sit down and go like, this is your responsibility, you should take on your responsibility, and then make a plan or like an easy concept they can get out to the media houses and also teach their employers. And I think the thing is that, I mean, we can be very idealistic about this, but they also have a commercial interest in doing this because otherwise they'll miss out on important stories. So it should be possible to push it through, but we'll see within the next year, so if it happens.
And they have some other security issues as well, like if you use a Slack-like service to write really compromising stuff about American wrestlers, that can be enough to get your media shut down if that leaks, for example. So they have some infrastructural concerns as well that are really interesting to help them with, like doing self-hosted secure services, finding products that are secure by default, and helping them manage a more secure work environment for their journalists.
Then there's also a development in the media branch today where more and more journalists are freelance and less have a steady job at a media house. So we have to give them some tools. Yeah.
You are, of course, I'm tempted to say, very focused on the journalists, and it kind of doesn't matter if the journalists are really good at all this encryption stuff and using the tools right and so on, if whoever they're talking to are as blank as you say the journalists were the first day you talked to them. So how do you, well, you cannot send, you cannot have the journalist send someone on a course before he starts talking to him. So how do you, you know, prepare the world for talking to a well-encrypted journalist?
Good question. 4 answers. Answer number 1. This is why we teach them Signal, because it's really easy for a journalist just to tell the source, like, install this app, go to your app store, install this app, it's secure, contact me there. So that's answer number one. Answer number two, I've also been working with Peter, amongst others, in making a whistleblower organization in Denmark that has a very sort of hands-on guide for future whistleblowers on how to communicate securely with journalists. So of course that leg also needs to be there, but ultimately it should be the journalist's responsibility that their source is not doesn't get in danger from communicating with her. So we can't leave that up to the whistleblowers because they're often in a very vulnerable situation, or the source. So this is why we try and give the journalists easy tools that they can teach on to the source. And answer number three is that all media should have a site that says this is how you contact us securely, and this is one of the things we want to push in the future, with a very sort of easy hands-on guide on how to contact either with Secure Drop or with Signal or whatever. And answer number four I forgot, so I'll probably remember that while Aslak talk.
So there are some really hard problems, like the first contact problem. If you get contacted by a source in an insecure way, you can't really secure all traces of that communication. But I think, like, by doing some of the steps that Freja was talking about, we can minimize the cases of sources that get themselves in trouble. I don't really think we should expect to find solution to those problems entirely, because they're really human and easy to make, but we can reduce them, I think, quite a lot.
Do we have other questions? Then I have one. What can the technical community do to help your course?
Well, I mean, the technical community has already done a lot and is doing a ton. I mean, this wouldn't have been possible without the Journo Techie collab, because I probably didn't say that clear enough, but it wasn't just Aslak and me at the schools. There's always a group of, I call them crypto heroes, and I think Aslak thinks that sounds really stupid, but I like it. Like a bunch of both IT students, but also just IT rights activists who come out there and help the journalists getting the stuff installed on their equipment and talking to them and building bonds that they can use in the future. And whenever we do big courses and classes, it really makes a world of difference that there's a group of people who come out there, and we've had some really, really good experiences at the schools of journalism where we've done crypto bars after the classes, and the students have stayed on there and learned more stuff, those who were specifically interested, and sort of drank some beer and bonded and all that, and that's been incredibly valuable. So when we do the classes, especially in the School of Media and Journalism, we always want to, if people want to come and meet journalists, it's a really, really big help. So just let us know. And then we also say to the journalists, as I mentioned, the 2-hour classes the grown-up journalists get is not enough. They need to ask for help when they need help. And the fact that there are people who are willing to help, and for example, they can go to Cryptohagen or whatever to get the help that they need, and we can send them in the right direction, is also really, really vital. So that's really important.
And on a bigger level, then there is a long rope of in the geek community about stupid users, and I think we should basically ditch it. And one of the reasons that we usually perceive users as stupid is because they don't know what they're doing, and that gives us a lot of problems, because we design software in a way that it actually has some knowledge requirements, it has some experience requirements to use in a proper way. I think on the software side, it's important to try to make secure by default applications that are really hard to use in a way where you screw up badly. Another thing, I think we should collaborate more with the social sciences. There is a lot of research. I think every 5 years there is a big survey on why users still can't figure out how to do PGP encryption. And maybe we should read those papers and look at the findings and see what we can take from that and use in changing the software or whatever. Passwords is another good example. A lot of password systems expect humans to remember and generate entropy in a way that's not possible by the human cognition. So look at some of the stuff that's made. There are a lot of research on how these things work in praxis. And we usually take decisions on behalf of our users on a regular basis because we really don't know how things are going to play out. And we kind of use our own experiences as our guiding thing. But we should look more into like the research that the social sciences does. And I'm sure that Irina is a good person to ask about that stuff.
And then finally, I also want to add that the book is built up in a way that the book makes you understand how surveillance works and how to use these tools and why you should use these tools. But then it also has a website where we try and keep it updated when tools change or are compromised or other things. And if you find any mistakes on that or anything you think should be added, you're more than welcome to write to me. That's also a really big help. Yeah. And it also has a Facebook page, if you want to follow it. Smooth. Yeah, but I think that was pretty much it. We also have some material and the book up here if you want to have a look in it and see how we've tried to communicate the stuff to journalists. And of course, as I think somebody mentioned down there, this is very focused on journalists, but it's definitely not only relevant for journalists, it's relevant for everybody who wants to protect their communication, and everybody should. And not just journalists, but also lawyers or psychologists or anybody else who works with confidential information, but really actually every citizen, because we have the right to privacy. So thank you so much for listening in, and yeah, come up and talk, or let's have a chunk in the bar afterwards. Yay! Chunk. Yay!